Well, thank you for joining us for this last presentation of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies series on Lincoln. We're very glad to have an audience here with us that looks so eager and alert at this time of day. You've been through a lot of sessions over the last 2 days. This is going to be one of the best ones, I can guarantee you, because we have a very interesting presentation by Austin Knuppe on Abraham Lincoln and Middle East foreign policy. No one has really done much pioneering work on this. And I think that Mr. Knuppe has done something very interesting in his research to find something new to say about Lincoln. Of course, that's always the challenge with Lincoln. How do you say something new? Well, Mr. Knuppe comes to us. He's a recent graduate from Calvin College, where he earned his bachelor's degree. He has interned in Washington, D.C. in a number of positions. He's also been a research assistant at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley. And before that, he came to us from Pleasanton, California, in the Bay Area, where his permanent home is. Please welcome Mr. Austin Knuppe.
Thanks, please. Well, thank you for coming. I know it's the end of a long day, and so I appreciate you guys sticking around. Before we progress on, I really need to give a couple thank yous. First, to the Michigan Council on the Social Studies. It's been a great afternoon, and I appreciate the chance to fill in for a speaker this afternoon. As well, I need to offer some thank yous to the Hauenstein Center, to Gleaves and Bryan. The product of this paper is really an compilation of a lot of different conversations we've had over the last couple weeks. And so anything you hear today that you like is probably based on the influence of those two guys. So I'm really appreciative. And finally, I need to thank the teachers here. It's my opinion, and I think those of everyone here, that no one hates history or the social studies. They only hate the way it's taught. And so that's really been an inspiration to me. And as Gleaves said, at Calvin, I studied history and political science as well. And so we're gathered here today to talk about Lincoln in the Middle East. Lincoln, of course, we've heard about all day. Really not something very obscure. Probably the most books have been written about him as compared to any other president or any other figure. The Middle East, however, it seems like this may be something that's more obscure. And so I think what we need to do to start this is to talk about what we already know about Lincoln and the Middle East, or diplomatic history. Kind of the crux of this paper is going to talk about misconceptions and how we can correct misconceptions about Lincoln's foreign policy, and kind of look at a new narrative for how we teach Lincoln's foreign policy and how we teach history of the Middle East. And so the first question I have is, what do we know about Lincoln's diplomatic policy? Outside of the Confederacy, what do we know about Lincoln and perhaps the great powers of Europe? Anyone?
Nothing.
Nothing. Yeah, Brian.
That he was trying to keep Europe out of the Civil War, trying to keep it a civil war.
Right, and so the predominant narrative of Lincoln and indeed Secretary of State Seward is that the majority of their efforts outside of dealing with wartime policy with the Confederacy was trying to prevent British and French intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. We know that the British were relying on Southern cotton, and so a blockade or a stoppage of Southern cotton would threaten Union relations with the British, as well as the French. So secondly, what do we know about the Middle East about this time? The 1860s. Commonly, when people study the Middle East, they study a modern history of the Middle East, which starts in 1945 and progresses to the present. As well, you'll have some texts or some people discuss U.S. relations with the Middle East from 1916 forward. 1916 is important because that's the date of the beginning of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottomans originate from Turkey, and they were allied in World War I. And they were already starting to crumble at that point, but the Great War really solidified their destruction. And so, like I mentioned, commonly our misconception is that U.S. foreign policy with the Arab world, whether it be Muslim North Africa or the Middle East, does not start until after World War I. And one of the misconceptions I want to correct this afternoon is that indeed U.S. foreign policy with the Middle East has been around since the founding, and more predominantly in the latter half of the 19th century. And finally, a theme in today's talk is going to be American Empire. Typically, we think American Empire of William McKinley in the Spanish-American War, 1898. We think of U.S. going abroad looking for a new frontier internationally, where we've continued to, on the home front, expand via Manifest Destiny and the railroads westward. We'll hear about Seward purchasing Alaska. But we think of this empire and this activity abroad typically with McKinley, and of course after Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Rider, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to demonstrate today that American empire really is a product of the consolidation of power after the end of the Civil War, politically, economically, and ideologically. So we want to extend this discourse about American empire back to 1865 and not begin in 1898. I think we're missing, well, we are indeed missing 40 years of important history if we begin in 1898. And this idea is not new. This is not an original argument of my own. Been influenced by what H.W. Brands has told me, and as well Walter Lefebvre wrote a book called The New Empire. And he formulates, as well some of his colleagues formulate, that empire starts much earlier. But I think this is novel in that I'm trying to connect a discourse about diplomatic history with the Middle East going back this far. And so I guess the thesis or the argument here is as follows. I hope to convince the audience that the United States' interaction with the Middle East helped lay the framework for American empire as early as 1865. And I guess I'll continue this attempt at success if I can introduce a new narrative about diplomatic history that considers Lincoln's and Seward's relationship with the Middle East as important to understanding America's role as a world superpower during Reconstruction and then thereafter. Excuse me. And to start, I want to look at three anecdotes, three stories about America's experience in the Middle East prior to the Civil War. The middle section of this paper is going to look at U.S. relations with the Middle East during the Civil War in relation to the great powers. But right now we need to look before that. And as Michael Oren, he's a Harvard historian, wrote a book called Power, Faith, and Fantasy, and he looks at U.S. relations with the Middle East since 1776. And so these stories are a compilation and heavily influenced by his work, so I need to pay credence to Michael Oren as well. But the first is we need to go back to 1790. And in the 1790s, there was an Algerian prince named Sidi Ibrahim who wrote On the Slave Trade. It was a treatise, an article for an American newspaper. And in it, Prince Ibrahim was arguing, it was a polemic, an argument for these slaves, which his Barbary pirates has captured. Algeria, of course, was part of the Barbary states, part of the North Africa. And since the founding, America was involved in commerce in the region. And Prince Ibrahim evidently had captured many white commercial sailors from the States, and he was making an argument as to why these captives belonged in his possession and why they would make good slaves. So it was an argument for enslaving these white citizens. And it's unique because it really espoused tons of outrage. You have Americans writing in their version of op-eds, or people are talking about this article, and they're infuriated that American citizens would be enslaved and that they'd be treated as property. And the irony, of course, is as anyone that knows anything about Ben Franklin knows that this was actually a satire and a polemic penned by Ben Franklin. He was in his older years, and he wrote under the pseudonym of this Algerian prince to show the absurdity of southern landowners and slave owners, their arguments of treating African Americans, blacks as slaves. So this is our first anecdote, and we see that already since the days of the founding, the United States has an intimate connection to the Middle East, and particularly at this time the Barbary states, which remember is North Africa. The second is Jefferson. Now we know that Jefferson is the first president to have a foreign policy concerned with the outside world, and particularly the Middle East. This is the time when we have the Barbary Wars. And in particular, 1805 is crucial. We have the capturing of the USS Philadelphia, which is outside of the Barbary states in the Mediterranean waters. It's captured by these pirates, these terrorists, if you will. And Jefferson is infuriated, and so he sends U.S. Marines. He sends a contingent of U.S. Marines paired with mercenaries, Arab countries that were friendly to the states that sent a contingent of troops as well, to recapture the vessel and free the sailors. And this may seem obscure, but to anyone that knows the anthem to the Marine Corps, this is where we get the portion of the song that says, "To the shores of Tripoli," the first time the U.S. has engaged the outside world and the Middle East is already 1805. Right? That's 6 years after the founding of the Republic. And it shows that even at this time, the United States has an understanding of what their national interest is, and they're willing to protect that militarily. And so we have a Barbary Wars. There's actually two set of Barbary Wars that go through Madison as well for a decade or so.